Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all having a good conference so far. So I'm Dana Nuccitelli, Research Coordinator for CCL and an environmental scientist and climate journalist, currently writing for Yale Climate Connections. So I thought we'd get started talking about some of the successes we've had in passing policies over the past couple years. Just as a nice little reminder, we got the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed a couple years ago that had some nice investments in energy infrastructure. We lobbied for and got the Hope for Homes Act, which had some funding for home weatherization. Growing Climate Solutions Act helped the agricultural industry connect to carbon markets, which is nice and helpful for them. The Chips and Science Act had some good investments for green and innovation in manufacturing. And then, of course, the big one just over a year ago was the Inflation Reduction Act. So lots of good stuff we've done. And of course, we did a lot to get the IRA over the finish line over that year or so that it took to get it passed. We had all these meetings with congressional offices, 225,000 contacts to Congress, published over 2,000 letters to the editor and 676 op-eds. So we did a lot of work and we got it done. And so let's kind of see where that puts us. This is our greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 until 2021. And this is where we were on track for before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, somewhere in the ballpark of a 27% cut in climate pollution by 2030, well short of our 50% cut by 2030 Paris target. And then after the Inflation Reduction Act, we're somewhere in this range. There's still a lot of uncertainty because there's a lot of different things that could happen. There's still clean energy permitting reform to be done, but somewhere in this green range. And hopefully, if we're successful with especially permitting reform, then hopefully we'll get to a 40% cut by 2030. So not yet to our Paris target, but it got us a lot closer. So the good stuff in the Inflation Reduction Act, the really big one, is that it's got these clean energy tax credits that's going to help us deploy especially solar panels and wind turbines. It's, of course, got the methane pollution fee, which is the first national price on a climate pollutant. So that will act as sort of a backstop once the EPA passes its new EPA regulations. Then, if companies are not in compliance with them with the EPA's methane regulations, then they would have to pay the methane fee from the Inflation Reduction Act, and so that will give them the financial incentive to actually reduce their methane pollution and be in compliance, particularly in the oil and gas industry. We got some tax credits for EVs, some money for building electrification and efficiency. We'll talk about those a little bit. Some funding for natural climate solutions, talk about those here a little bit too. And some money for innovation and domestic green manufacturing, which we're already seeing a lot of those new clean technology manufacturing plants popping up all over the place. So, as a result of all that good stuff, we're going to see a very different economy in 2030 than we do today. Up to 85% of our electricity is going to be from clean sources. The asterisk there is, again, because that depends on clean energy permitting reform, as we'll be talking about here in a minute. But if we're successful there, then the amount of power production from solar and wind and other clean sources is going to triple compared to what it is today. So we're going to see a huge explosion, hopefully, in these clean energy, especially solar panels. Potentially most new cars and trucks sold in 2030 will be electric. We'll talk about that in a minute. And again, we're getting all these new clean energy manufacturing jobs, also building retrofits and clean energy deployments is going to create about 1 million new jobs in clean energy by 2030. So yeah, we're already seeing this big growth in EV car sales. This is a chart of the share, the percentage of new car sales in the United States that is EVs, and you can see it's really exploded. It's got this exponential growth, especially over the past 3 years or so. It's really going up fast, getting up to pretty close to 9% of new car sales in the US being EVs at this point. Where I'm in California, we're actually up to 25% of new car sales are EVs. So that's really taken off, and that's been really nice to see. And then projecting out into the future, you can see the black is up to 2022. This is projections from the EPA because the EPA just recently published some draft tailpipe pollution rules. And so the gray is what the EPA was projecting the share of EV car sales would be going into the future before their rule. And the green is when they take their new rule into account. So you can see in 2030, we were on track for something like 40% of new car sales PEVs in 2030. And now we're up to about 60% if the EPA's rules go into effect. So somewhere in that 50% range, probably, of new car sales in the US in 2030 will be EVs, which is a very, very different picture than it is today. And the US is actually behind most of the rest of the world in this share of EV car sales. This is globally. You can see 2022, 14% of global car sales were EVs in 2022. That's supposed to be up to about 18% this year. And you can see projecting out into 2030, it's somewhere in the 75% range of new car sales globally in 2030 will be EVs. So we're hearing a lot of arguments right now about like, should we try to slow things down because like we're worried about jobs in car manufacturing in the United States, and some people are saying, hey, we should stop this transition to EVs. But the transition is underway. It's happening in 2030 around the world. Most new car sales are going to be EVs, and so if you want to keep your auto manufacturing jobs, it's going to have to be in EVs. And so we really need to push forward and do as much EV manufacturing and battery manufacturing in the United States as possible. And fortunately, the Inflation Reduction Act is helping with that, with a lot of incentives for domestic manufacturing of clean technologies. So shifting back over to clean energy, wind and solar especially, as we know from the Princeton Energy Modeling Group, if we don't start building our clean energy infrastructure faster, especially electrical transmission lines, we're not going to achieve most of the emissions reductions from the Inflation Reduction Act, potentially only 20% if we keep building electrical transmission infrastructure at the same rate as we have been, which is just growing at 1% per year. We need to get faster transmission build out. So you can see that from this chart, this is where we were historically in terms of adding wind and solar power generation every year in the United States. So you can see wind and solar have been growing steadily, pretty quickly, but we're hoping to speed that up. And so the Princeton Modeling Group looked at these different transmission scenarios, and they said if we continue building transmission at our current rate of 1% per year, then the picture will look like this out to 2030. So it's a little bit faster growth, but not a whole lot faster growth than we have had over the past decade or so. If we can speed the transmission build out up to 1.5% per year, it looks like this yellow line. And so now we're starting to see that exponential, really fast growth again. And if we can get that even faster up to 2% growth in electrical transmission infrastructure every year, then it's this blue line that grows even faster. And so you can see how important it is to get our electrical transmission infrastructure permitted and built faster so that we can get more solar and wind energy connected to the grid and get this exponential growth in clean energy and make this transition to a clean economy. And there was just this report published by the International Energy Agency where they put together this, they call it a net zero roadmap, looking at how the world can get to net zero emissions by 2050 to stay on track with a 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. And they have this quote in there for all countries: speeding up permitting, extending and modernizing electricity grids, addressing supply chain bottlenecks, and securely integrating variable renewables are critical. Building grids today can take more than a decade, with permitting a particularly time-consuming bottleneck. So slow permitting is an issue in a lot of countries. It's an issue in Europe too, although they're taking some good steps to address it, and it is definitely an issue in the United States. And so the IEA is saying, do something about it and speed this stuff up. So let's talk about permitting reform then. Our goal when we aim to do permitting reform is to streamline the efficiency of the permitting process. So we're not trying to just greenlight every single project that gets proposed, but we are trying to get to the final approval or denial of the permits, that ultimate yes or no decision, in a more expedient manner, because we want to build our energy infrastructure faster. That would have a lot of different benefits in terms of improving the reliability, the security, and the affordability of our energy and of our power grid. And then in the process, we're also trying to bolster community involvement in the permitting process, as I'll talk about here in a couple minutes. But first, how are we going to improve the reliability of the grid? And this has been especially a problem because we're seeing more of these extreme weather events, these heat waves, heat domes, polar vortexes, floods, hurricanes, all these things that can knock out part of the power supply. And at the same time, sometimes they can increase power demand, because if it's really hot or really cold, then you need cooling or heating. And so you've got reduced supply and increased demand, and that can cause power outages. And so we definitely want to avoid power outages, especially in dangerous extreme weather conditions. And so one way to help solve this is to be able to transfer electricity from an area outside of the extreme weather event, so they can send their extra electricity to the area inside the extreme weather event and help to prevent some of those blackouts. And so one bill that does that, which we're going to be talking about more pretty soon, and I'll be doing actually a CCU about on a couple Thursdays from now, the 19th, I think, of October, is the Big Wires Act. This bill with this super excellent name that was just introduced recently in both the House and the Senate, which basically does just that. It tells each region of the country you have to be able to import a certain amount of electricity from your neighbors so that you can improve the stability of the grid in your region. So that's a really useful thing for improving grid stability. And it will also, by building more transmission between regions, allow us to add more solar and wind to the grid. But that bill doesn't do anything to speed up the slow permitting process of those big electrical transmission lines. And so that's another thing we would like to resolve in the permitting process by doing things like having the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, be able to do the permitting of these interstate transmission lines. Because currently, when a project developer is trying to build this big transmission line that goes across multiple states, they have to do the permitting process in each individual state that the transmission line is going to go through. And that's a lot of paperwork and red tape, and it takes a very long time, generally over a decade, to get that all done. Whereas if we could do it all in FERC, FERC would then coordinate the permitting, or coordinate with each individual state and locality, but they would do all the permitting in that one, basically it's a one-stop permitting shop, which is much more efficient, goes much faster. That's what we do with interstate natural gas pipelines, and they take something like half as long to permit as interstate electrical transmission lines. So that's what we're trying to get, something like that done in permitting reform too. Another roadblock is that when there's a transmission line being built, everybody fights over who's going to pay for how much of it. And so one solution to that is just to have FERC allocate the costs proportional to who benefits, which you have to come up with a formula for that that's consistent among different regions. So that's another thing we're trying to potentially get done. And then there's also a proposal that, since the grid is this big national complicated thing, we're trying to improve the security of the grid, but it takes a lot of planning, to create a dedicated Office of Transmission within FERC to help us with that kind of large scale planning of the grid. So those are kind of the different things we're trying to do to improve the reliability of the grid and also allow it to take on more wind and solar power. And then I mentioned the importance of early community involvement. That's because, for one thing, when a big infrastructure project is being built through your community, you want to have your voice heard and your input taken into consideration in the permitting of that project. That's just fair. And then also, when that happens, it reduces the risk of later lawsuits because when people are excluded from the permitting process, it's often that ticks them off. They get angry, they disagree with the ultimate decision, and then they bring a lawsuit. And then lawsuits take years and years to work their way through the judicial system, and then that extends the timeline of the project for years and years. And so we want to avoid that whenever possible, both so that we're getting everybody's input and so that we're avoiding these lengthy lawsuits. And so it's a win-win to actually get the community involved early in the permitting process. So from some proposals for exactly how to do that, you can have federal agencies identify a chief community engagement officer and then give federal agencies funds to do community engagement. We can also have federal agencies let them require community benefit agreements for these projects, which that's basically an agreement between a project developer and the local community to do some stuff that will benefit the community so that the community is then more favorable to the project, which is things like potentially hiring local residents for jobs for the project, for example. We could also just simply tell federal agencies to provide meaningful public involvement opportunities in the permitting process, put that in the law. And we can provide support for project pre-development programs, which is a variety of things, but includes potentially giving communities grants so that they have the resources to then become involved in the permitting process. So there's a lot of different things we can do to bolster early community involvement in the permitting process. And then there are reforms to the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which is the main environmental law that governs the permitting process, not the only one, but kind of the main one. So most of these that have been proposed were actually already passed in the debt ceiling deal, the Fiscal Responsibility Act. But some of the stuff we passed includes when there are multiple federal agencies working on the permitting of a project to designate a lead agency that makes the ultimate decision, and then the other agencies kind of provide feedback to that one decision-making agency to make the decision-making process more efficient. To have all those agencies work together on a single environmental review document instead of each doing their own document and duplicating efforts, because that's inefficient. It also set time and page limits on these environmental assessments, environmental impact reports, to try to get agencies to do them more expediently. It also allowed project applicants, or more likely their contractors, to draft those environmental documents. And then the federal agencies have to review them and take responsibility for their accuracy. So it takes the workload off of the federal agencies so they don't have to write these huge documents, but they do have to make sure they're accurate. And then it also started the process of creating an online permitting portal so that we'll be able to see on a website where in the permitting process a given project is to add some transparency to the process. So those are all generally good things that were passed. They're not going to make like a huge difference in speeding up permitting, but they'll make a little bit of a difference. And so they were generally helpful reforms passed in the debt ceiling deal. And then another issue that's come up is the statute of limitations on NEPA lawsuits, because currently once a NEPA permit is granted, then there's a 6-year window during which a lawsuit can still be brought. And that is a long, long time and creates a lot of uncertainty for a project developer. And so there have been a variety of proposals to shorten that to various lengths, between 2 months and to 3 years, which is a big window. There's a lot of disagreement about exactly how much we should shorten the statute of limitations. We need to be careful not to shorten it too much, because if an organization is considering bringing a lawsuit and they're running up against that statute of limitations and it's about to run out, that kind of forces their hand, and then they're more likely to bring the lawsuits. Whereas if they had like a few more months to consider, maybe they would decide the lawsuit wouldn't be fruitful and decide not to bring it. So you don't want to rush it too much, but you also want to shorten it so there's less of this uncertainty for project developers. And so I'm sure there'll be a lot of negotiation between members of Congress, and they'll probably find some kind of sweet spot in the middle here where they can agree to a shortening, but hopefully not too much of a shortening of this statute of limitations. And then some other proposed permitting reforms. There's an existing system called Fast 41, which is like this interagency council that for big important energy infrastructure projects, they'll give it like an expedited high level review. It's consisting of relatively high level staffers of all the federal agencies that work on permitting. So that seems to work really well. And so there have been proposals to expand it. Currently, projects have to have $200 million in investments to qualify for Fast 41. And so, for example, Senator Manchin's bill proposed lowering that threshold to $50 million so that more projects can qualify. Another good suggestion was to have federal agencies look at maps of sensitive areas of environmental and other sensitivity all around the country and find areas where there are gaps of low sensitivity and call those like low impact go-to areas where we should build infrastructure projects because they're not sensitive. And because we have designated those as low impact go-to areas, they can get an expedited permitting process. So that's a very smart idea. We could also consider more co-benefits of these projects. So for example, if you're going to build an electrical transmission line, you could consider that's going to improve the stability of the grid. It's probably going to let us build more wind and solar, which will reduce air pollution and reduce climate pollution. And so the more of these benefits you consider, the more likely you are to approve the project ultimately. We could also, if there has been an environmental document done for a project before the NEPA process, allow it to be reused during the NEPA process to avoid duplicative work, as long as the site and the project have remained basically the same. And then geothermal energy, which I think you guys heard about last night, is a really interesting area. Right now, permitting for geothermal drilling is a very, very slow process. Whereas permitting for oil and gas drilling over the years has gotten a lot of exemptions. They basically argue it's a small footprint, so it has a small environmental impact, and so the permitting of oil and gas drilling is very fast. And so their proposals suggest give geothermal drilling the same expedited permitting that oil and gas drilling already gets, which I think makes a lot of sense. And that would help speed up our geothermal projects. And then it's also been proposed to do regular federal land lease sales specifically for geothermal projects because we have a lot of potential geothermal energy underneath federal lands. And so we should try to tap into that because that is a great, clean, firm, reliable source of energy if we can tap into it. And then to build all this clean energy infrastructure, we're going to need a lot of minerals, critical minerals. And so there have been some proposals to improve domestic mineral exploration and development permitting as well. Because ideally, we would get more of these minerals from the United States where we have better environmental regulations and health and safety and things like that than mining in certain other countries. So this is kind of what we are on track for before permitting reform. The Inflation Reduction Act will get us a little bit more, but if we can't speed things up in terms of building energy infrastructure, we're still headed for probably something like 28% cuts by 2030. But if we can get permitting reform passed, and we are already making some progress because, for example, FERC has put out some new rules to hopefully speed up the permitting process. But we still need Congress to do stuff. And so if we can get that all done, then we'll get to that 40% cuts by 2030 that we saw in the previous slide. But as mentioned, that is still well short of our 50% by 2030 Paris target, which you can see in this dotted line across the middle. And so the way we can close the rest of that gap is with a carbon price. I think it's important to note that carbon pricing also would benefit from permitting reform because carbon pricing creates the financial incentive to deploy clean energy technologies, especially like solar and wind again. But if the permitting process slows that down, then the financial incentive doesn't do as much good as it otherwise would. And so permitting reform and a carbon price are very complementary policies. And so we would like to pass them both. So, of course, as everybody I'm sure has heard, we got the Energy Innovation Act introduced in the House again, which would put the price on fossil fuels at their source, take that money from the carbon price, return all of it back to households and carbon cash back, and also put the carbon border adjustments as we export or import products across our border to make sure that dirtier competition from foreign sources that does not have a carbon price and has not reduced their carbon pollution does not have a financial advantage over our cleaner domestic products. So that's our three-legged stool. The bill is almost the same as the version that was introduced in the last session of Congress. The price still starts at $15 per ton, still will increase $10 per ton per year as long as we're meeting our emissions reduction targets. Still has the 100% cash back to adults, 50% cash back to childs, the border carbon adjustment, all that stuff. The only thing that's really different is that we have changed there's a table of emissions reduction targets per year, which the last time the bill was passed was before we updated our Paris commitments to 50% cuts by 2030. And so the previous version would have got us to something like 40 to 45% cuts by 2030, just because we were aiming for net zero by 2050, but we didn't have a 2030 target. Now we have a 2030 target, and so we updated the targets in the bill so that it's consistent with 50% cuts by 2030 and still net zero by 2050. But otherwise, the bill is basically all the same for the most part. And it has lots of great benefits. It will get us again to 50% cuts by 2030, net zero by 2050. It will create affordable clean energy, put money in people's pockets, and save lives. So let's go over the data again behind those benefits, which if you were on the All Supporters call or watched the recording, you saw me talk about this. But just briefly, we just saw that it's going to get us to net zero by 2030 in combination with permitting reform, but it also has the targets that I mentioned to get us to net zero by 2050. So you can see the gray here is our historical emissions. The red is our current path if we get permitting reform passed successfully. And then the blue is the additional on top of that emissions targets in the bill. So you can see it accelerates things out to 2030, and then it's got this steady decrease in emissions to 2050. If in any year we're not on this track, if we're above, our emissions are above this path, then the price increases by $15 per ton the next year instead of $10 per ton to get us back on track with this emissions reductions target range. And then the affordable clean energy achieves that because it basically incentivizes clean energy deployment, especially solar and wind, which are the cheapest sources of new electricity today. So the more solar and wind we can get, the cheaper our electricity will get. It also transitions us away from fossil fuels who have unstable prices that often cause price shocks and inflation. And there's been some research showing that carbon pricing promotes innovation in clean technologies. And so that will help us develop more cheaper clean energy as well, clean technologies. And then there's the monthly carbon cash back that puts money directly in the pockets of American families. So for families that have low carbon footprints, the equally sized carbon cashback checks that they will receive will be larger than their increased costs from energy and other costs. And so, pardon me, low and middle income families, most of them will actually come out ahead. They will get a net income. And so that will also have the added benefit of reducing income inequality in the United States and also lifting a lot of people out of poverty. There was a study just a couple years ago that found that an energy innovation sized carbon fee and dividend would lift 1.6 million Americans, including 500,000 children, out of poverty within 5 years. So it's got all these added benefits on top of reducing carbon pollution very quickly. And then it's good for our health because we're again accelerating the phase out of fossil fuels, replacing with clean energy, which reduces air pollution, which is responsible for about 250,000 premature American deaths per year. So if we're able to get on track for net zero by 2050 with permitting reform and carbon pricing and some other policies like the Inflation Reduction Act, altogether that will help us avoid 1.4 million premature deaths over 20 years and 4.5 million premature deaths over the next 50 years, according to some recent research by this scientist Drew Shindell out of Duke. So that is our picture. If we can get permitting reform and a carbon price passed, but we're not going to stop there. We also are working on healthy forests as another one of our policy areas, which people ask about because we haven't talked about it too much lately. That's because Congress has been a little slow on in this area. They were supposed to pass a farm bill this year, but they got busy with other stuff and they kind of kicked the can and pushed it out to next year. So we are expecting them to pass a farm bill in 2024. We are expecting them to include some healthy forests bills in that farm bill. So we are waiting for them to introduce a number of hopefully good forest policies, forest bills. And once that happens, then we'll be talking more about healthy forests. In the meantime, the Inflation Reduction Act did have funds for things like urban trees and climate smart conservation that can include some healthy forest projects, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And CCLers can also still work on local tree planting projects like in their cities and urban tree projects and things like that. So there was a really nice study a couple years ago that was looking at the potential of different natural climate solutions in the United States to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And so you can see on the left here, these two big bars. These are reforestation, planting more trees, and forest management. And so I kind of summarize those here in terms of reforestation, that big bar. The big components are agroforestry, which is combining agriculture and trees, and especially silvopasture, which is combining grazing pasture land and trees, which you can kind of see in this nice photo here with the cows grazing in between the trees. CCL staffers will tell you I'm a little bit obsessed with silvopasture because that is the really big potential natural solution in terms of reducing US emissions because we have a lot of pasture land, a lot of potential to put trees there. The livestock would benefit from the shade provided by the trees, so it's kind of a win-win solution with a lot of potential. And there's also urban trees, which are kind of another really big chunk of potential emissions if we could plant more trees in cities. And actually, the US Forest Service awarded just about a week ago over $1 billion in grants from the Inflation Reduction Act to urban forest projects in every single state. There's something like 350 or 380 projects that they awarded. And so actually, if you go to the site-wide forums on community and go to our policy areas and go to the Healthy Forests forum, I did a little forum post where you can kind of click over to the page and you can go to your state and look at all the different projects in probably just about every city in your state to see what got awarded money for these urban forest projects. And then forest management, I mentioned we should pass some good policies there to improve our forest management to store more carbon in our forests. And we also need to work on forest resilience to hopefully reduce things like wildfire risks that then release a lot of carbon into the atmosphere too. So a lot of stuff we can still do on forests. We're just kind of waiting for the farm bill and policies to get introduced. We did also almost a year ago send this comment to the USDA because the USDA also in the Inflation Reduction Act got about $20 billion for climate smart conservation programs. And then they like basically put out a request for comments asking like, how should we deploy? How should we spend this money? Like, how should we prioritize things? And so we at CCL sent them a comment kind of with basically the data that I showed in the chart a couple slides ago, showing like, hey, look, there's a lot of potential for reforestation, including silvopasture. These programs can potentially fund silvopasture projects, so you should prioritize those. And so that's another way in which we are getting involved in the healthy forests area is kind of giving some suggestions to the federal agencies on how what they can do with the IRA funds to deploy some healthy forest solutions. And then we also have this issue of tree equity that we're trying to solve, including especially with urban tree projects. So currently, communities of color have 33% less tree canopy than predominantly white neighborhoods. Poor communities have 41% less tree canopy than wealthy neighborhoods. And studies have shown that increasing urban tree coverage is really good for people's health. It avoids premature deaths, or it basically does a lot of good stuff like reducing stress. It provides shade and cooling. Trees are great, and so we need more urban trees, especially in these communities that have a lack of urban trees. To check out what your local community looks like in terms of tree equity coverage, you can go to this great website, treeequityscore.org, and it kind of shows like which areas are lacking and have a tree inequity problem where it would be good if we would plant some more trees, especially in those particular areas. And then finally, we have the final policy area, building efficiency and electrification, which if we can get all four of these successfully passed, we can actually get to 60% cuts by 2030, blow through the Paris target, make it look like child's play. So we don't hear too much about this policy area either because the policies were already passed that we need in the Inflation Reduction Act. And so now it's just a matter of educating people about those policies. So the tax credits are available now for all of these clean technologies. And so what we're waiting for now is the upfront rebates, which were the second part of the Inflation Reduction Act that just takes time to get kind of the programs and the paperwork in order. Each individual state is working on that right now. And so we expect those to roll out maybe starting at the end of this year, but more heading into 2024. And as states start rolling out those programs and making them available, then we'll do more educational actions at that point to try to make sure everybody in our communities is aware that the tax credits and the rebates are available once that is the case. For things like heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, induction stoves, home weatherization, solar panels, all that good stuff. We have some resources to do that already. We have this nice flyer on the left that talks about all the different tax credits and rebates that are available. You can find that on the CCL website if you type in like Inflation Reduction Act flyer, I believe, in community. And on the right here, I also put this really nice artist rendition of what the different Inflation Reduction Act incentives look like for all the different stuff around your house. Heat pumps, EVs, and all that. That's by this really cool artist named Nicole Kilner. You can go to our website, NicoleKellner.com, if you want to check this out. She has prints available that you can like print out a large copy, potentially frame it, and then you can put it on your table if you want to do tabling. And it's a nice attention draw there. NicoleKellner.com is the name again. So I'm going to stop there because I have to go in about 10 to 15 minutes. So I will be happy to take questions until then.
Okay.
If that was a question in the room, I wasn't able to catch
Oh,
that.
sorry. I'll repeat that, Dana. Yeah. Is ag still exempt in this new bill? And if so, what's the plan for reducing ag emissions?
Yeah, so basically fossil fuel use on farms is exempted. Actually, if you go to, again, the site-wide forums are policy areas, and I believe somewhere on there was just a question about this. And Tony had a nice answer, providing details of the agricultural exemption. I think that's where it was on the forum. Yeah, but it turns out, I mean, that's a very small chunk of our overall emissions, so it doesn't make much of a difference. So yeah, to tackle agricultural emissions, we could pass other policies. We could also encourage people to eat less meat. That would reduce agriculture-related emissions. And then we can also do various natural climate solutions that will help actually store more carbon on farms, including through agroforestry, as I mentioned, encouraging farms to plant more trees, which has some co-benefits associated with that. So there's a variety of things that we can do. But yeah, in terms of the Energy Innovation Act, while there is an agricultural exemption, it's a pretty small chunk of emissions, so it doesn't make a huge difference.
The question there is, what kind of timeline do we have to? Yeah, okay, you heard some of that, Dana.
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay. What kind of timeline do we have in Congress to promote this bill? For the current session.
Yeah, I mean, basically in the current session, we're basically trying to build the support so that it has some momentum going into the next session. We think it's pretty unlikely to pass in the current session, given the kind of instability in the House, especially. So we're just trying to, at this point, get members of Congress, particularly trying to get Republican members of Congress as co-sponsors, but we're also trying to get kind of a list of Democratic representatives ready to be co-sponsors once they decide to add more to the list. So that's kind of where it's at right now, is just trying to build that support for the long term.
Smaller. But the other one is conservation is environment. But it's Congress or state government trying to do it. I think there are people who do it, but that's a technology. That's not.
So the first question was, how about power decentralization, which would get around some of the transmission line issues? Maybe I'll let you take that one first.
Sure. So yeah, distributed power, things like putting solar panels on rooftops and parking lots so that you need less transmission is always a good thing. The challenge there is that basically the smaller your solar project is or other energy project is, the less you benefit from the economies of scale. And so building a big solar farm is the most cost-effective way to get your energy deployed. So and also there's only so many rooftops and parking lots available. So the short answer is that yes, that reduces our transmission needs. So yes, it's a useful thing to do, but we need to do both. We need to do both distributed power on things like rooftop and parking lot solar panels, and we need to do these big farms, wind farms and solar farms out in rural areas that are going to need transmission, just because we're going to need so much more clean energy. Like we need like 2 to 3 times more clean energy in the coming decades than we have today. So we're also going to need transmission. So we just need to do both at the same time. There's so much energy that we're going to need to electrify everything that we need to do all the different solutions that we can.
Got it. And the second part to that question was, are you aware of efforts to help with conservation? And I don't sure. Efficiency, any particular efforts? And then
Yeah. So in terms of building efficiency, there were these incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act to weatherize homes. Those are some of the things that we're going to see once those upfront rebate programs get rolled out. There's also in transmission lines, there are ways to make transmission lines basically be able to transport more currents. They're called grid enhancing technologies. And so those kinds of things, we're trying to create incentives for utilities to deploy those. Because some other countries have been doing that and it works very well because we're very conservative in the amount of electricity we send through transmission lines because we don't want them to like sag and collapse and catch fire and things like that. But we're more conservative than we need to be if we had technologies to kind of track the weather conditions and like how hot is it out right now and how much wind is there. And so, we could be sending more electricity through these transmission lines right now. So there's a variety of things we can do. And then electric vehicles are more efficient than gasoline powered cars, and not driving at all is more efficient than driving an electric car. So there's certainly a lot of things we can do in terms of increasing efficiency. And we're trying to deploy as many of those as possible, including through the Inflation Reduction Act. And of course, the Energy Innovation Act, putting a price on carbon, also incentivizes more efficiency as well.
yes, okay, yeah, and I missed that part. There also the question came up about efficiency of gas powered cars, and if you're aware of anything related to that.
Yeah, I mean, basically the EPA's tailpipe rules that I mentioned, they just say cars have to become so much more efficient. They don't say like you have to sell a certain percentage of EVs. It's just that to reach those higher efficiency levels, we expect automakers to meet those by selling more EVs. But it just says like you have to make your cars more efficient. It's just we have cars have been tending to get heavier because both like we're buying bigger cars and we're buying cars with more safety in there, and making the cars safer against crashes tends to make them heavier. And so while we've been increasing efficiency, like we've lost some of that potential efficiency by making cars heavier through both like just being bigger and being safer. So yeah, there are some challenges there. So the best way to increase vehicle efficiency is just to transition to electric cars, which are much more efficient than gasoline powered cars.
The question was, how much influence did CCL have when negotiating the Inflation Reduction Act? And if you're aware of that.
Yeah, I mean, I had the slide that showed all the different things we did in terms of talking to members of Congress and LTEs and op-eds. So certainly like we put our weight behind it. So did a lot of other climate and environmental groups. So I'd say like everybody, or just about everybody in the climate space, did a really good job of pushing our members of Congress to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, and CCL was like a part of that. So we definitely played an important role, I would say.
Okay, so it's who are the champions for the geothermal exemption?
Yeah,
Make
so
it before. Okay.
yeah. Interestingly, actually, that was a proposal by House Republicans in HR 1, which is like HR 1 is the very first bill passed or introduced by the House. They always reserve HR 1 for the bill that the incoming House majority thinks is the most important thing. And Republicans made HR 1 about energy and permitting. And so there was lots of stuff in there. Some of it was, not so good fossil fuel stuff, but some of it was useful permitting stuff. And one of the things they proposed was this increased or this leasing of federal land for geothermal projects, and also to give geothermal drilling the same permitting exemptions as oil and gas drilling. I think a lot of that is because a lot of oil and gas companies are very interested in geothermal energy right now because they have that drilling expertise from the whole fracking boom, where now they have these technologies where they can drill deep and drill horizontally. And it's like technologies that apply to geothermal energy as well. And so that's kind of a potential off ramp for oil and gas companies to get into clean energy, is to develop some expertise in geothermal energy. And so they also, those companies have some influence over some Republican lawmakers. And so I think they got in their ears and said, hey, let's do some stuff on geothermal and permitting reform. And so it's actually interesting Republicans who are the most interested in getting geothermal stuff into permitting reform. So that's, I think, an area where we can have a lot of agreement between Republicans and Democrats to get some nice, clean geothermal permitting reform done.
The question here was about carbon-intensive industries sidestepping some of the carbon taxes by promising not to cut down forests that weren't going to be cut down anyway. Have you heard of this, and are you aware of any efforts to counteract that?
So yeah, that's basically getting carbon offsets on the voluntary markets, which, yeah, voluntary market carbon offsets are very hairy because a lot of them are associated with forestry projects. And yes, a lot of them are either like buying some land that you're saying you're preserving the forest when actually the forest wasn't going to be cut down anyway, or maybe you buy some forest land, and then if you're in like California and you buy the forest in California, then the forest burns up in a wildfire, and then your carbon offsets literally go up in smoke. So yeah, voluntary carbon offset markets are pretty notoriously bad. And so like companies that say like we are like zero carbon or low carbon or something like that because we buy these offsets, like that is not the case. They're just like continuing their operations and buying offsets that are not real to pretend that they are not high carbon anymore. So yeah, those voluntary offset markets are pretty bogus, but the Energy Innovation Act doesn't have anything associated with carbon offsets in it. So any good policy to reduce climate pollution will not include those kinds of offsets. And I apologize, I have to go to get to my next commitments. But I hope you guys have a good rest of your conference, and nice to talk to you all.